and now recording. Over to you.
Lovely. Thanks, Leo. So I'm Dr. Fran Ramsden. I'm an obstetrics and gynecology, so women's health registrar in the UK NHS. And I'm also an academic at King's College London. And then I do some consulting and digital health work alongside those roles. So it's my pleasure today to be hosting this webinar where Clare and Gemma are very boldly and bravely going to be sharing their experiences of IVF and miscarriage, and really just have a conversation about what their experiences have been like, and touching on the themes of why perhaps many women stay silent on this, but also how much of a toll it can take on you, particularly through the perspective of professional working women. So my pleasure to hand over to Clare, who's going to introduce herself and start talking about some of her story.
Thanks, Fran. So I'm Clare, and I'm one of Leo's co-founders at Nexus. And in sharing this, it might give a bit of insight into why that's an important journey for me. So why I wanted to get on board with Nexus. And my story around IVF and miscarriage is I've been doing IVF for over 4 years now, unsuccessfully. And I started that process quite late for a number of reasons. One of which was I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. So I made some incorrect assumptions about age, didn't really understand the impact of age on egg quality and things like that. So I was 40 when I started the process. As a result, age is always against you. So that led to me suffering from 3 miscarriages, all of which required surgery. So everybody talks about miscarriage in the way that it's shown on TV, very sudden and bloody and very sort of urgent. But actually, there's so many miscarriages that happen silently. And you don't find out that that's happened until you go for a scan and you're expecting better news. And aside from the 3 miscarriages, countless failed IVF cycles where the transfer didn't work. So very, very familiar with loss and very, very familiar with sort of keeping that secret in the workplace, which is something I feel very passionate about. And as a result, like I alluded to earlier, it's just kind of driven this personal mission I'm coming to the end of my journey now, but I just feel so passionate about being more open and talking about it, because I often find that when I'm open, other people open up too. And quite often those people are going through it alone and they don't have support, and I can be a bit of a support network for them and use some of my experience. That's my story.
Thank you, Clare, and appreciate it's really not easy to share. Thank you. Gemma, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and start talking about your story.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Gemma. I'm a advisor and investor for Nexus at the moment. I'm also in training to be a holistic coach. My background is very much sales. So I've had 3 health tech startups now, and I've been in that space for about the past 10 years. Prior to that, I was in a very corporate environment working in pharmaceutical marketing and advertising. And this is kind of where I had my first miscarriage experience. And it actually occurred during a very pivotal time in my career when I was selling my first company. So we were kind of midway through an acquisition process. And actually, I found that the stigma, I suppose, started when I said to one of my colleagues, acquaintances, that I was a little bit worried and I'd been having some bleeding. And their first response was, "I didn't even know you were trying. Isn't this a really bad time?" So in that moment, I just went, okay, completely shut down. And as Claire said, it's very dramatic on TV a lot of the time when you look at miscarriage. And I've had two now, and both experiences and how I felt about them, how they manifested physically and emotionally, the timing, everything were completely different. But for this conversation, I'll talk about the first one, since it happened in the workplace, so to speak. So yeah, the thing I found most difficult was the silence. So you just push it all down. In that moment, that first comment, just that there was nobody that I could speak to. And then this thing just started to keep happening. And then by like the second day, it was impossible to ignore. But we had a very big meeting and I had to fly to New York. And I remember being in a boardroom full of men whilst miscarrying. And I didn't tell anybody. And I just pushed all of the emotional symptoms down. And all the while, my brain is going, oh my God, it's because I drank all of that coffee. Oh my God, it's because I was working too hard. The guilt is coming in, the physical pain. And I felt very lucky because I didn't have, I'm speaking quite graphically here, because I think it needs to be talked about. I didn't have very intense cramps, but I needed to go to the bathroom like kind of every 20 minutes. And when you're in a boardroom trying to sell your company, that's impossible. It's very, very difficult and very traumatic. And I feel so much guilt around that whole situation. But I just kept pushing through and pushing through and pushing through. And very interestingly, and I'm sure the two are connected, that trauma that I pushed down as I started to heal physically, which took probably 3 or 4 months. And then I started to go a bit deeper emotionally. And I'd done the thing, I'd sold the company, I had the big job, and then I contracted meningitis and ended up in hospital for a very long time. And everything it was like a tower moment for me. So if I'd had someone to speak to, probably from the time, if I'm honest, probably from the time that I realized I was pregnant, because I didn't tell anybody that I was working with because fear of judgment. My God, but you're selling a company. You can't do that. You can't have a baby now. All of this noise, all of this noise. Maybe I would have had more support. I would have taken some time out when I was tired and I knew I needed to rest. I wouldn't have drunk all of that coffee. All these things wouldn't have happened. It was just so isolating, like completely isolating. And I think that's, for me, it's grief, right? And for every woman, it's different. Some women want distraction, they just want to get on with it. For others, it's impossible, but it is a grief. And so why aren't the policies, why aren't the comments and the things people say, why isn't the support network there in the same way as it is if you're experiencing grief, if you lose someone, right? So yeah, that's my kind of introduction, which was very long, but I do think it's very important to speak frankly and openly, like Claire said. And I was astounded when I did start to open up. Almost every woman that I talked to had this experience. Not my exact experience, but they had experienced miscarriage, or they definitely knew somebody who had, and just not talking about it.
Thank you, Gemma. And again, really, really appreciate how honest your sharing of your experiences. And again, sorry to hear the really difficult things that both of you have been through, but I think such an important topic for discussion. And I wanted to start by asking you both, sort of tapping a little bit more into what were the factors that led you to that, I guess, conscious or unconscious choice to really almost to have to hide what was going on at work. thinking about, I guess, the demands and expectations on working individuals, thinking about perhaps what our expectations of ourselves are in terms of what we can cope with, and sort of society's influence into that. So yeah, just a bit more, if you're happy to go into that a little bit more, onto your sort of, we've heard about how that sort of played out, but a bit more about why do you think this is so common? Why is it, do you think, that people feel they can't share and end up in these incredibly isolated and traumatic and difficult experiences? So I don't know if either one of you wants to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think Gemma hit the nail on the head when she said fear of judgment. So for me, it's fear of judgment, but also other people's assumptions. So yeah, the people that, some people that did know what I was doing, there were comments like, "Oh, is it not a bit late for that?" You know, it's like, well, yes, I know it's late. I don't need you to remind me of that. So, but for me, the biggest driver in the workplace was people's assumptions. Most people assume that IVF is a magic pill and it's going to work. And it's impossible in the workplace to not tell anybody, because one of the challenges in the workplace is the unpredictability of appointments. So you don't get much notice. You've got to come for a scan. It's got to be on that day. And in my case, I'm now doing IVF abroad, so you've got to be in Denmark in 5 days. You need some people to understand what you're doing, so that it makes sense that you're making these last minute requests. And when I first mentioned my journey to my employer, I didn't get a very favourable response. I was made to feel that was very inconvenient for the company, because I was going to be off for 12 months. And that was really upsetting, because I'd been given a 5% chance of success anyway. So for me, the likelihood of that happening was very small. So right at the beginning of my journey, I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, that's what people think. People think that this is going to work. So for me, if I wasn't going to become a parent, then my career was all I had. And I didn't want people to be making decisions about what I should and shouldn't be involved in case I was going to be off or have other responsibilities. So that was probably the main driver for me, for staying silent in the workplace. And that played out several times with the sort of that inconvenience aspect. And it's quite hard to burden the guilt of that and the worry. The fact that I'm going a little bit off topic now, but just it kind of flows from that sort of expectation and assumptions. The anxiety that the appointment, so you already know that you're inconvenient to the company, but working through when your appointments might be and worrying that they might coincide with an important meeting that you're supposed to be at, and managing the guilt and the anxiety from that is really, really challenging. So much so that on my last, well, whichever round it was, I ended up coming out to the people higher up the sort of the chain, just because there was a huge meeting, and it just always happens like this. The meeting was on exactly the same day that I had to be in Denmark for my transfer, so there was no way that I could make it work, and I didn't want to come across as being flaky or uncommitted. So I felt like in that moment I didn't have a choice but to tell people further up the chain. And in that moment, actually, that was really well received, and I felt heard and supported. But you just don't know how people are going to react. So it is often safer to stay silent until the pain of that becomes more than the pain of not speaking about it. So I never experienced unfair treatment, but there have been surveys that have shown that 25% of people, when they do tell their employer, they do experience unfair treatment as a result. And because there is no protection around it, it doesn't surprise me. I never felt like I would be treated unfairly. I just thought that opportunities would be taken away from me. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting, and I think shows just the complexity of managing home and personal life, I think, as a woman, but particularly navigating fertility and reproduction is a really, really, really big challenge. And I think discrimination is very, very real. Certainly in as a working in antenatal clinics, we hear stories of that all the time. So it's not in people's heads. And I was mentioning before the call that we routinely refer pregnant women to maternity action because of discrimination. So this is something that there's no easy answers, because there is an impact, as you say. There's a degree to which things get compromised. You might not be available. There's some more uncertainty, but then you have to think. I think this asks much broader questions of society and what kind of companies and workplaces and how we look after individuals and employees, and that's true in the public and in the private sector. I think it raises a lot of questions, although there's not many easy answers other than protection in law, I think, because particularly for small businesses, it can be a challenge. Gemma, I wondered if you had any more thoughts on this topic before we move on.
Yeah, sure. So again, same to Claire, assumptions. If you do reach out to a couple of people, there are a lot of assumptions that can just make you feel kind of more overwhelmed, judged, and confused a lot of the time. Those unhelpful comments where people, they don't know what to say. Well, actually, they don't know what to say, so they say nothing at all. Is that a Boyzone song?
Yes.
Is that Ronan? You say it best and you say nothing. Sorry, bit like relief there on a tangent. So yeah, useful, unhelpful comments such as you can try again. Oh, it was still early, all mixed in with assumptions where people don't know what to say, so they just blurt out stuff or they haven't really thought that through, all based on assumptions. How do you know if I can try again? How do you know what that journey is? You don't know this because we're not talking about it, because I'm not able to express it for fear of judgment. It's going to affect my career. And then I think also as a culture in the workplace, and I'm talking particularly about the corporate workplace, from my own experience, I'm not saying this is everywhere, but there still needs to be a shift to value people over performance. We still value performance over people. So every conversation that I had post miscarriage was all related to how much time I was going to take up. All of these practical aspects, how it was going to affect the business, but what would happen if I couldn't show up on this day. And you just, to take care of your health and to heal and stuff, you can't be consistent in the way that your employer, or the people around you that you're working with want you to be, because it's not a linear process what you're going through. So again, everything just becomes silent, and you turn up and you show up to the meetings where you can, and it just goes further down. But that will come up eventually. We store this trauma in the body. With me with meningitis, that's an extreme example. But what I think needs to happen is that employers really need to look at shifting their culture, that HR managers could really get some training, some trauma-informed training on how to deal with women's and men's fertility journey. So they're in a position where they can offer like supportive networks, counselling, people that they can reach out to, but also, and I think this is really important, I don't feel like we should have to go to our employer asking for what we want or need, because you might not necessarily know, as I mentioned earlier, because it's just so messy. And it should be the other way around. We should be able to express what's happening, and your employer or HR manager should be trained and prepared enough to say, okay, I'm so sorry to hear about your experience. What do you need? This is what we currently offer. is that enough for you? How can I help? So no assumptions, not making it, you know, just holding space in that moment and talking about the human aspect, not for any reason to get you back to work, to get you to that meeting. Because when you're going through something like this, you're not going to show up as your best. And it makes me think, looking at it from a different angle, I mentioned earlier on at the start, but I think it's important to bring up the challenges that I face in the workplace. You know, they started when my first pregnancy, actually. Very lucky to have a beautiful daughter, Seren. But from the moment I announced my pregnancy, these comments started kind of circling around. And I was actually the first woman in my company, so I was the only senior female exec. And I managed to get a maternity leave policy put in with HR that wasn't there before. But how I managed to do that was basically pitch to them a business argument about retaining female talent and about, productivity and about, the performance of women. If we do offer flexibility, we're going to come back and we're going to be more engaged and all of these things. And I wouldn't do that now. I would do it from a human perspective. And I would dig my heels in and I would really fight to shift that culture, because we're all humans. And women make up 50% of the population, for God's sake. Like, why are we still being treated and discriminated against as a minority? And I think that cultural shift is so important. Things have been moving, but we're still not there yet. As well. Men have even less rights, okay? If their partner has a miscarriage, they're going through that as well in their own way. And I'm not sure what the policies are, with fathers taking time off compared to mothers or women going through the IVF journey or miscarriage. But there's a lot of work to be done from a cultural perspective, and that's what kept me silent. The culture and the assumptions and the unhelpful comments that made me feel that my experience was less than, and I didn't have a right to feel the way I did.
And that's really interesting, actually, because one of the things that I'd say I didn't know it when I first started supporting women through miscarriages in my sort of gynecology work, is that there's actually studies been done looking at sort of trauma, grief, emotional responses to miscarriage, and the age, the gestational age of the pregnancy, so how pregnant you were when it happens, has got no impact on it. So a woman who has a very early loss may have as deep and traumatic an experience as someone who has a later loss. So this sort of, and I guess because there's a few things that are challenging. It's common, but that doesn't make it okay. Like it's sort of, we all, I think, well, do we all know? One of the things that I talk about a lot when I see women with miscarriages is trying to say that, it's not their fault, because, you talked about coffee and working too hard, and women come with tremendous amounts of guilt that they've caused it. When obviously in the vast majority of cases, it's something that was just the way that particular embryo developed that wasn't compatible with life. But I think, it's really important that as you say, there's this huge component actually around the workplace education and understanding to enable support, the appropriate support, and these sort of things, like the fact that the grief and the trauma, it doesn't matter when it occurred. That's probably not something that many people know. And obviously it's something that you can never put yourself in someone else's shoes, but unfortunately people often do take a perspective on this. And so I wonder if you've touched on so many important things there, Gemma, but one of the things around sort of workplace education, because we are seeing that these movements now with sort of menopause education, perimenopause education, but there's so much more. There's a real focus on perimenopause and menopause at the moment, but of course there's so much more in a woman's reproductive lifespan, and then obviously post-menopausal life, and there's nuance and detail to supporting each of those stages. And what I'm hearing from you both is that your employers, and certainly those initial conversations that you had, those people were not equipped to have those conversations with you, and that shows the very, very real challenge that women are facing, and the sort of the scale of the problem, because this is not about, there's no, you say it's not low-hanging fruit. And even from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, there is no, most places don't have policies or guidance on miscarriage. So it's a very, very grey area. I know we're getting very, very close to time. I wanted to give a few more minutes to maybe thinking about how your experiences, where the toll has been greatest to you personally. If you're happy to share that, obviously don't feel that you have to if you don't want to. If you could change one thing, what would it be that you would really want to see changed to help women, who come after you?
I'll go first. So the toll is really the emotional toll. The physical toll it's easy to recover from that in comparison to the emotional toll. You carry that with you forever. And for me, so having more support in place and those sort of legal rights. So there's amazing organizations. So like Fertility Matters at Work, their whole purpose is to work with organizations to make them more fertility friendly, whether that's the maternity policies like Gemma was talking about, but all the way through to the right to time off for IVF. Because one of the ridiculous things is that if you look through company policies, IVF is kind of bundled in with cosmetic and elective surgeries, and it's absolutely not a choice. Nobody would choose to go through this journey. So having more resources available to them and more companies that are actually interested in understanding why it's important and seeking their services and their help. So the help is out there for companies to become more literate around this stuff. It's just that they don't put enough value on it. They don't understand why that's important. So yeah, just to summarize, it's the emotional aspect of it for me. I can deal with doing injections in toilets, and I can deal with surgery, that I can bounce back from that. But the emotional side and the damage to some relationships as well that occurs as a result of it. And just to go back to one of Gemma's points as well about the comments. One thing that I've learned, because most people are well-meaning, one thing that I've learned through this journey is that when somebody's going through something terrible, the best thing you can do is say, I'm so sorry that you're going through that. How can I help? Rather than, well, at least it was this, or at least it was that, or have you tried this? And I always know that that's coming from a good place, but it's really not helpful in the time. So if more people understood that it's just to be heard and a little bit of empathy, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, I hear you. Gemma?
Again, similar to Claire, the emotional toll for me, that's the lasting thing. But also we haven't addressed, and I guess this is physical and emotional, but the dysregulation of your hormones, right? When you go through, first when you're in pregnancy, when you lose a pregnancy, it takes such a long time to adjust. And I guess, I don't know, as a doctor, would you describe that as a physical aspect, because it's also emotional as well?
But they're deeply intertwined. But absolutely. You know, pregnancy has huge changes in all of your physiology. There isn't a system, so like your heart, your liver, your brain, everything starts changing very, very early on. And actually, a lot of those changes have occurred by 12 weeks. So, you know, again, people think it's very early. You know, it's not such a big deal, but actually, physiologically speaking, like your heart has remodeled. You know, you're pumping a different volume of blood. You know, you've got loads of water on board. So many things are changing. And then, of course, with loss, then you have the sort of the other side of that. So absolutely, you know, there is a very huge amounts of physiological change that occur from very, very early on to support the developing pregnancy. And then obviously it will take time for things to regulate. And, you know, some women experience, you know, luckily not in your cases, some women experience high degrees of blood loss that can take a long time to recover from. So there are a lot of different complexities from a physical perspective as well as a mental health. There's a lot of possibilities. But yeah, I'd say that it's not you know, it's not in your mind. It's absolutely not in your mind. You know, of course, the emotions and the trauma, they are sort of, I guess, cognitively experienced, but your emotions will be influenced by your hormones as well. And I think most people who've gone through IVF, you know, and I went through an egg freezing round recently, like you really start to feel it at some point. I think some, not everyone, because as we know, Nexus people know about the fact that not, you know, there's huge variability in how people respond to hormones, but you know, they're really big shifts, and all this takes time, as you say, for your body to recover and get back to, you know, the previous sort of level of homeostasis. Yeah.
Can I just add something to that? Because, and this is relevant not just for people who've experienced miscarriage or IVF, but those the first trimester of a pregnancy is one of the most difficult in terms of sickness, isn't it? So, and actually that's normally the time when people are keeping their pregnancy to themselves. And I remember, I've been pregnant 3 times. The last one was okay, but the first 2 I felt absolutely horrendous. First one was COVID. I was doing COVID tests. I was so convinced I had COVID. I felt that bad. But I was still showing up for work, unable to say why I was feeling so poorly, why I couldn't concentrate. And actually that is what most pregnant woman has to go through, whether or not she's dealing with the trauma of loss or IVF fertility treatment. It's something that I don't think is acknowledged enough in the workplace.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I remember a very well meaning male friend of mine many years ago saying, oh, you know, it annoys me so much when women have got their pregnancy badge on and they don't even look pregnant. And I had tried not to, you know, kill him on the spot. But I went into the detail of all the physiological changes that actually probably the first 12 weeks is one of the highest chances that you're going to pass out because everything is changing. And he sort of looked at me like this, and it's like, yeah, stay in your lane because you just don't know. You just don't know. And many women probably don't even know, actually, but there's tremendous changing occurring from early on. And I think, you know, this taps into all of this lack of knowledge and awareness, and then the lack of support, the comments that aren't helpful because people don't have, and I think there's also, I know we've not talked about it so much, but there's also, certainly, like I said, in my clinical practice, there's so much shame, particularly for some women in certain cultural, you know, from certain cultural backgrounds, like having a miscarriage is like really not okay culturally. It's something that they feel they have to hide from their families, sometimes even from their partners. So there's so many levels of complexity here in terms of, you know, why, as you say, women are being silenced. But I think, really complex issues. But I think really great that we've been able to sort of talk about things today. So is there anything more that you wanted to add, or we can pause at this point and we've got a little bit of time for questions?
Back to the questions.
So any questions? I can't see anything in the chat. Has anyone got any questions that they'd like to ask live, or anything they want to share?
I will stop the recording now, just in case anyone wants to ask them without the recording being on, which obviously is completely understandable. Or if you can't unmute yourself, then please feel free to type them in the chat instead.
And one